The House of the Wolfings. Chapter 7. They gathered to the folkmote. When it was the morning, all the host of the marmen was astir on either side of the water, and when they had broken their fast, they got speedily into array, and were presently on the road again, and the host was now strung out longer yet. For the space between water and would once more diminish till at last it was no wider than 10 men might go abreast, and looking ahead it was as if the wild would swallowed up both river and road. But the fighting men hastened on merrily with their hearts raised high, since they knew that they would soon be falling in with more of their people, and the coming fight was growing a clearer picture to their eyes. So from side to side of the river they shouted out the cries of their houses, or friend called to friend across the eddies of Muckwood water, and there was game and glee enough. So they fared till the wood gave way before them, and lo, the beginning of another plain, somewhat like the midmark. There also the water widened out before them, and there were eyots in it with stony shores crowned with willow or with alder, and aspens rising from the midst of them. But as for the plain, it was thus much different from midmark that the wood which begirt it rose on the south into low hills, and away beyond them were other hills blue in the distance, for the most bare of wood, and not right high. The pastures of the wild bull and the bison, whereas now dwelt a folk somewhat scattered and feeble, hunters and herdsmen with little tillage about their abodes, a folk akin to the markmen and allied to them. They had come into those parts later than the markmen, as the old tales told, which said moreover that in days gone by a folk dwelt among those hills who were alien from the Goths and great foes to the markmen. And how that on a time they came down from their hills with a great host, together with newcomers of their own blood, and made their way through the wild wood, and fell upon the upper mark, and how that there befell a fearful battle that endured for 3 days, and the first day the aliens worsted the marmen, who were but a few, since they were they of the upper mark only. So the aliens burned their houses and slew their old men, and drave off many of their women and children, and the remnant of the men of the upper mark with all that they had, which was now but little, took refuge in an island of Muckwood water, where they fenced themselves as well as they could for that night, for they expected the succor of their kindred of the midmark and the nethermark, unto whom they had sped the war arrow when they first had tidings of the onset of the aliens. So at the sunrising they sacrificed to the gods 20 chieftains of the aliens whom they had taken, and therewithal a maiden of their own kindred, the daughter of their war duke, that she might lead that mighty company to the house of the gods. And thereto was she nothing loath, but went right willingly. There then they awaited the onset. But the men of midmark came up in the morning, when the battle was but just joined, and fell on so fiercely that the aliens gave back, and then they of the upper mark stormed out of their eyot, and fell on over the ford, and fought till the water ran red with their blood, and the blood of the foemen. So the aliens gave back before the onset of the markmen all over the meads, but when they came to the hillocks and the tofts of the half-burned habitations, and the wood was on their flank, they made a stand again, and once more the battle waxed hot. For they were very many, and had many bowmen. There fell the warduke of the marmen, whose daughter had been offered up for victory, and his name was Agni, so that the tofts where he fell have since been called Agni's tofts. So that day they fought all over the plain, and a great many died, both of the aliens and the markmen, and though these last were victorious, yet when the sun went down there still were the aliens abiding in the upper mark, fenced by their Wainberg, beaten, and much diminished in number, but still a host of men, while of the markmen many had fallen, and many more were hurt, because the aliens were good bowmen. But on the morrow again, as the old tale told, came up the men of the nethermark fresh and unwounded, and so the battle began again on the southern limit of the upper mark where the aliens had made their Wainberg. But not long did it endure, for the markmen fell on so fiercely that they stormed over the Wainberg and slew all before them, and there was a very great slaughter of the aliens, so great, tells the old tale, that never again durst they meet the markmen in war. Thus went forth the host of the markmen, faring along both sides of the water into the upper mark, and on the west side, where went the Wolfings, the ground now rose by a long slope into a low hill, and when they came unto the brow thereof, they beheld before them the whole plain of the upper mark, and the dwellings of the kindred therein, all girdled about by the wildwood, and beyond, the blue hills of the herdsmen, and beyond them still, a long way aloof, lying like a white cloud on the verge of the heavens, the snowy tops of the great mountains. And as they looked down unto the plain they saw it embroidered, as it were, round about the habitations which lay within ken by crowds of many people, and the banners of the kindreds, and the arms of men. And many a place they saw named after the ancient battle and that great slaughter of the aliens. On their left hand lay the river, and as it now fairly entered with them into the upper mark, it spread out into wide rippling shallows beset with yet more sandy eyots, amongst which was one much greater, rising amid most into a low hill, grassy and bare of tree or bush, and this was the island whereon the markmen stood on the first day of the great battle, and it was now called the Island of the Gods. Thereby was the ford, which was firm and good and changed little from year to year, so that all Marmen knew it well, and it was called Battleford. Thereover now crossed all the eastern companies, footmen and horsemen, freemen and thralls, wains and banners, with shouting and laughter, and the noise of horns and the lowing of neat, till all that plain's end was flooded with the host of the Marmen. But when the eastern abiders had crossed, they made no stay, but went duly ordered about their banners, winding on toward the first of the abodes on the western side of the water. Because it was but a little way southwest of this that the Thingstead of the Uppermark lay, and the whole folk was summoned thither when war threatened from the south, just as it was called to the Thingstead of the Nethermark when the threat of war came from the north. But the western companies stayed on the brow of that low hill till all the eastern men were over the river and on their way to the Thingstead, and then they moved on. So came the Wolfings and their fellows up to the dwellings of the northernmost kindred, who were called the Dalings, and bore on their banner the image of the rising sun. Thereabout was the mark somewhat more hilly and broken than in the midmark, so that the great roof of the Dalings, which was a very big house, stood on a hillock whose sides had been cleft down sheer on all sides save one, which was left as a bridge, by the labor of men. And it was a very defensible place. Thereon were now gathered round about the roof all the stay-at-homes of the kindred, who greeted with joyous cries the men-at-arms as they passed. Albeit one very old man, who sat in a chair near to the edge of the sheer hill looking on the war array, when he saw the Wolfing banner draw near, stood up to gaze on it, and then shook his head sadly, and sank back again into his chair, and covered his face with his hands. And when the folk saw that, a silence bred of the coldness of fear fell on them, for that elder was deemed a foreseeing man. But as those three fellows, of whose talk of yesterday the tale has told, drew near and beheld what the old carle did, for they were riding together this day also, the beaming man laid his hand on Wolfkettle's rein and said, Lo you, neighbor, if thy Vala hath seen not, yet hath this old man seen somewhat, and that somewhat even as the little lad saw it. Many a mother's son shall fall before the Welshmen. But Wolfkettle shook his rein free, and his face reddened as of one who is angry, yet he kept silence, while the Elking said, Let be, Toady. For he that lives shall tell the tale to the foreseers, and shall make them wiser than they are today. Then laughed Toady, as one who would not be thought to be too heedful of the morrow. But Wolfkettle brake out into speech and rhyme, and said, O warriors, the Wolfing kindred shall live or it shall die, and alive it shall be as the oak tree when the summer storm goes by, but dead it shall be as its bole that they hew for the corner post of some fair and mighty folk hall, and the roof of a war-fain host. So therewith they rode their ways past the abode of the Dalings. Straight to the wood went all the host, and so into it by a wide way cleft through the thicket, and in some 30 minutes they came thereby into a great wood-lawn cleared amidst of it by the work of men's hands. There already was much of the host gathered, sitting or standing in a great ring round about a space bare of men, where amidmost rose a great mound raised by men's hands and wrought into steps to be the sitting places of the chosen elders and chief men of the kindred. And atop the mound was flat and smooth save for a turf bench or seat that went athwart it whereon 10 men might sit. All the wains save the banner wains had been left behind at the Daling abode, nor was any beast there save the holy beasts who drew the banner, wains and 20 white horses that stood wreathed about with flowers within the ring of warriors. And these were for the burnt offering to be given to the gods for a happy day of battle. Even the war horses of the host they must leave in the wood without the woodlawn, and all men were afoot who were there. For this was the Thingstead of the Uppermark and the holiest place of the Markmen, and no beast, either neat, sheep, or horse might pasture there, but was straightway slain and burned if he wandered there. Nor might any man eat therein save at the holy feasts when offerings were made to the gods. So the Wolfings took their place there in the ring of men with the Elkings on their right hand and the Beamings on their left. And in the midst of the Wolfing array stood Theodulf clad in the dwarf-wrought hauberk, but his head was bare, for he had sworn over the cup of renown that he would fight unhelmed throughout all that trouble, and would bear no shield in any battle thereof however fierce the onset might be. Short and curling close to his head was his black hair, a little grizzled so that it looked like rings of hard dark iron. His forehead was high and smooth, his lips full and red, his eyes steady and wide open, and all his face joyous with the thought of the fame of his deeds and the coming battle with a foeman whom the Marmen knew not yet. He was tall and wide-shouldered, but so exceeding well-fashioned of all his limbs and body that he looked no huge man. He was a man well beloved of women, and children would mostly run to him gladly and play with him. A most fell warrior was he, whose deeds no man of the mark could equal, but blithe of speech even when he was sorrowful of mood, a man that knew not bitterness of heart, and for all his exceeding might and valiancy, he was proud and high to no man, so that the very thralls loved him. He was not abounding in words in the field, Nor did he use much the custom of those days in reviling and defying with words the foe that was to be smitten with swords. There were those who had seen him in the field for the first time who deemed him slack at the work, for he would not always press on with the foremost, but would hold him a little aback, and while the battle was young he forbore to smite, and would do nothing but help a kinsman who was hard pressed or succor the wounded. So that if men were dealing with no very hard matter, and their hearts were high and overweening, he would come home at whiles with unbloodied blade. But no man blamed him save those who knew him not, for his intent was that the younger men should win themselves fame and so raise their courage and become high-hearted and stout. But when the stour was hard and the battle was broken and the hearts of men began to fail them and doubt fell upon the Marmen, then was he another man to see, wise, but swift and dangerous, rushing on as if shot out by some mighty engine, heedful of all, on either side and in front, running hither and thither as the fight failed and the fire of battle faltered, his sword so swift and deadly that it was as if he wielded the very lightning of the heavens, for with the sword it was ever his wont to fight. But it must be said that when the foemen turned their backs and the chase began, then Theodulf would nowise withhold his might as in the early battle, but ever led the chase and smote on the right hand and on the left, sparing none, and crying out to the men of the kindred not to weary in their work, but to fulfill all the hours of their day. For thuswise would he say, and this was a word of his: Let us rest tomorrow, fellows, since today we have fought amain. Let not these men we have smitten come aback on our hands again, and say, Ye wolfing warriors, ye have done your work but ill, fall to now and do it again, like the craftsman who learneth his skill. Such then was Theodulf, and ever was he the chosen leader of the Wolfings and often the war-duke of the whole folk. By his side stood the other chosen leader, whose name was Heriulf, a man well stricken in years, but very mighty and valiant, wise in war and well renowned, of few words save in battle, and therein a singer of songs, a laugher, a joyous man, a merry companion. He was a much bigger man than Theodulf, and indeed so huge was his stature that he seemed to be of the kindred of the mountain giants, and his bodily might went with his stature, so that no one man might deal with him body to body. His face was big, his cheekbones high, his nose like an eagle's neb, his mouth wide, his chin square and big, his eyes light gray and fierce under shaggy eyebrows, his hair white and long. Such were his raiment and weapons that he wore a coat of fence of dark iron scales sewn unto horse hide, and a dark iron helm fashioned above his brow into the similitude of the wolf's head with gaping jaws, and this he had wrought for himself with his own hands, for he was a good smith. A round buckler he bore and a huge twybill which no man of the kindred could well wield save himself, and it was done both blade and shaft with knots and runes in gold, and he loved that twybill well and called it the wolf's sister. There then stood Heriulf, looking no less than one of the forefathers of the kindred come back again to the battle of the Wolfings. He was well beloved for his wondrous might, and he was no hard man, though so fell a warrior, and though a few words, as aforesaid, was a blithe companion to old and young. In numberless battles had he fought, and men deemed it a wonder that Odin had not taken to him a man so much after his own heart, and they said it was neighborly done of the father of the slain to forbear his company so long, and showed how well he loved the Wolfing house. For a good while yet came other bands of markmen into the Thingstead, but at last there was an end of their coming. Then the ring of men opened, and 10 warriors of the Dalings made their way through it, and one of them, the oldest, bore in his hand the war-horn of the Dalings, for this kindred had charge of the Thingstead and of all appertaining to it. So while his 9 fellows stood round about the speech hill, the old warrior clomb up to the topmost of it and blew a blast on the horn. Thereon they who were sitting rose up, and they who were talking each to each held their peace, and the whole ring drew nigh to the hill, so that there was a clear space behind them, twixt them and the wood, and a space before them between them and the hill, wherein were those 9 warriors and the horses for the burnt offering and the altar of the gods, and now were all well within earshot of a man speaking amidst the silence in a clear voice. But there were gathered of the Marmen to that place some 4,000 men, all chosen warriors and doughty men, and of the thralls and aliens dwelling with them they were leading 2,000. But not all of the freemen of the upper mark could be at the thing, for needs must there be some guard to the passes of the wood toward the south and the hills of the herdsmen, whereas it was no wise impassable to a wisely led host. So 500 men, what of freemen, what of thralls, abode there to guard the wild wood, and these looked to have some helping from the hillmen. Now came an ancient warrior into the space between the men and the wild wood, holding in his hand a kindled torch, and first he faced due south by the sun, then, turning, he slowly paced the whole circle going from east to west, and so until he had reached the place he started from. Then he dashed the torch to the ground and quenched the fire, and so went his ways to his own company again. Then the old Daling warrior on the mountaintop drew his sword and waved it flashing in the sun toward the four quarters of the heavens, and thereafter blew again a blast on the war horn. Then fell utter silence on the whole assembly, and the wood was still around them, save here and there the stamping of a war horse or the sound of his tugging at the woodland grass, for there was little resort of birds to the depths of the thicket. And the summer morning was windless.